Okay, so good morning. Two things up front. First, on the 26th of November, which is today, in 2 weeks' time, I will not be here. So we need to move the lesson to a different date. The proposal is on Friday the 23rd. And not now, but let's say at the end of the lesson, I would like to make a short call and see what is the most convenient time for you. We probably can't do it well for everyone, but at least we can try to minimize the disruption. The second thing was, because we had a short discussion after our last session about what I'm doing, so I'm just briefly want to show you, this is where I was last week. Not exactly this, because this is being built right now. Yeah, this is our new production site in Romania, and it's exactly it's exactly here. So you can see the international airport of Timișoara from our side. But okay, this doesn't work. It's not good. Does this work? This works. Okay, good. So it's it's really in the west of Romania, and Bob, komm mal rüber hier. Wo bist du? Da. And you have down here, you already have an industrial site, and close to this is the new area where we are building our new plant. Yeah? So what I'm doing there is I'm responsible for the automation part of the production lines. So that, managing that as a project. So doing what I'm talking about there in practice. That's just wanted to show you so you have an idea of what I'm doing outside of the 1.5 hours when I'm here. We are continuing with the project setup and project planning part, which we started last time. And you remember, we went through the initiation. We talked about how we need to set up a project charter, and that we need to set up at all in order to put together all the assumptions, everything that is that characterize our project. And we also discussed then that one of the major issues today in today's project is, first of all, of course, you need to get approval for the budget. So somebody needs to give you the whatever, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, 100 million, whatever the project is, yeah, the money to do that. Also internally, if you want to sort of refurbish your apartment, you need money for that. So somebody, I don't know, your husband, your wife, your parents, your kids, somebody owns the budget and they will tell you, okay, you can spend 1,000 euro on that, same thing. The second critical part really is the availability of the right, and that means the skillful people that you need in the project. So when you know, for example, that you need, let's say, independent on what we're doing, let's say you need a tax expert, because you are building a new production site somewhere, let's say somewhere in Eastern Europe, and you have no idea what their tax legislation looks like and how they are locally organized in terms of making sure that corporations adhere to all the environmental laws. If you take one from your own internal, let's say, German project organization, this person will probably not know what to do. So you need an expert on that. And that's very critical for you as a project manager to figure out which experts you need and also get the commitment that the experts are available. Because once you start and once you commit to timelines and you figure out then later on that you don't have the correct people in the project to make the correct decisions, then you have the problem. As long as you didn't start, it's an issue of the organization to make sure you get all the required resources, or rather give a task to you and say, okay, we need to hire this person from external. So we already said last time that the actual planning, meaning what do we need to do, when do we need to do it, what are the detailed costs involved, how do we manage risk, blah, blah. All of that cannot be done by the project manager alone. So he will set up a team at the beginning, which will then grow throughout the initial phase of the project to make sure that he covers all the relevant aspects, and also that he involves all the relevant persons. We had last time, we had a discussion about where do the people sort of come from. If you have a standard organization, people are, for example, organized in departments. You have a department that is responsible maybe for mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, for the software, blah, blah. But in the project, you need to have them all together. So you need to be sure that the people responsible for the department know what you want from them. And that they know that, for example, a certain person, her, let's say, star programmer, that she is not available in the next 6 months because you need her for the project. They need to know that. So, to start, the project manager has the responsibility, and he or she must make sure that all the roles and responsibilities in the project, that they are clearly defined, which means that people know what they have to do, what they are responsible for. If they don't know that, how can we expect them to do the right thing? They can't. Yeah? And of course, there's a constraint to that, and say, don't over-organize. I have seen project organization charts for a project with let's say, 100,000 euros budget, about 150 person days of effort, where we have like 15 boxes in the organization chart. That's probably a little bit too much. You're spending too much time organizing and not so much time working. That doesn't make sense. So the questions that need to be answered are, which roles do exist? And here we can start from, let's say, standards. What are the responsibilities of each role? Here we can also start from standards. And who takes over which role? That's of course project specific, yeah, because that's what your organization or your student project team needs to agree on. We discussed that already I think last time and the time before, that even in a 3-person project, it is absolutely beneficial to have or to decide who is going to be the touch master. Yeah. Who says, okay, now we're concentrating on this, and this is what we need to deliver until whatever, next week, next month, something, and not have everything self-organized and at the end of the day agree on nothing. So, if we look at the roles that are generally accepted as being part of a project, in this case according to the project management body of knowledge, this is what we have always. We have the project manager, of course, that's you, yeah, who is responsible to make sure that the team is led in a way that the project objectives are achieved. Then we have the team members, and team members are all people who somehow contribute, and let's say a bit of work, an artifact or something, to the project so that the project can achieve its objectives. The functional manager or the line manager is let's say, in most organizations, is the person, or functional managers are those persons who are responsible to provide the right people. So you have a functional manager who is responsible, or a line manager who is responsible for making sure we have all the competences regarding electrical design, or mechanical design, or software engineering. And these persons will normally not participate directly in the project, but they will be responsible to provide to you, as a project manager, a person who can do certain things. So if you say in your project, I need someone who is able to write a web service in Java with this and this and this constraint, the functional manager for in this case, the software engineering department would be responsible to tell you, okay, this is the guy or the girl who can do this. And I reserve the time that he or she needs to do this work in the project for you. And the other way around, you would have to tell them, you would have to inform them in case you have, let's say, a delay in the project, you have an extension of the scope, so originally, let's just assume 4 weeks that you required the person, that would become 6 weeks, because these guys also need to plan. They provide people to different projects. So if your project suddenly takes on 8 weeks out instead of 4, that may mean that another project has to be moved, or that your project has to stop because another project is more important. Yeah. So while these guys are not directly involved in the project, it's very important to talk to them, and in making sure that whatever resource requirement you have, that can be fulfilled. We already talked a lot about the stakeholders, and stakeholders is everyone who has a stake in the project, yeah? Which means that everyone who is affected or may be affected or think they are affected by the project, in that sense that a decision is taken in the project, something is done in the project that has an influence on them. So, for example, if you're thinking back about our project, or let's say about the project idea that we had, where we are synchronizing the HR SAP part with Active Directory. Today, this is something where you have some kind of interaction going on between the Human Resources Department and IT. So these two need to be somehow involved because they need to know that their process of work is going to change. When we automate that process, it means that what they do today, maybe somebody takes the phone or sends an email and says you have to add this guy to Active Directory and you have to put him into this group, blah, blah, blah. This is going to go away. You need to inform them before, and you need to ask them, that's a matter of requirements management, if that's all that they do. Or maybe they use that email for something else. Could be. They use it to print something, yeah, which is not in the scope of your project, but which would not work anymore in case you're stopping that process. So these are typical stakeholders. So finally, the project sponsor is the person, or in most cases, it's really a person who is backing the project from a management perspective. And he is overall accountable for the project. Accountable means that he will finally decide, okay, what we did is correct or not, so if we meet our objectives. And he also has to defend the original purpose of the project towards the other guys in the management. So normally it's not his money that he's providing to the project, but it's company money. So and if he says, I'm spending 100,000 euros on this project, it's the project manager's responsibility to make sure these 100,000 euros are spent according to the project purpose. But it's the project sponsor's responsibility to justify that the purpose is good. So that means that the purpose is worth the spending. That's his responsibility, or hers. And finally, I've added here the PMO, so a project management office. And that's something when you go into an organization and you have the task, let's say you are getting the task of running your first project. And that's also true for academic institutions, by the way. So when you do your first project, maybe not as a student project, there as well, but especially when in case you are working as a, for example, research assistant. You should always ask, what are our standards for project management? How do we set up projects? How do we do controlling of cost? What are our standards for specifying requirements? All of this, yeah? This should always be the first question to ask. Because if then you get the answer, we don't have any, do what you want, then you know you are free. But what really is a bad situation is if you start to do something, you think best practice from your point of view, you start writing, you start organizing, etc. And 3 weeks later, someone comes along and says, yeah, why didn't you talk to our project management responsible? He would have given you all the templates, so you wasted just time to do that. Yeah. And in an organization, it's a matter of professionalism to make sure that whatever is provided can be used. Because your task as a project manager is not to invent project management, but to manage the project. That's different. And the PMO is, at least in larger corporations, is the organizational structure that is responsible for standardizing everything related to project execution. So how we set up projects, how we provide the information to get projects released, how do we do reporting, how do we make sure that you remember the experience feedback, lessons learned, how do we organize that, how do we make sure that the next project of the same kind, we don't do the same mistakes. All of this is the responsibility of this organization. And if it doesn't exist, there may at least be, let's say, some kind of best practices somewhere in the company which makes sense to use. Yeah? And if it doesn't exist and you have a possibility to influence that, try to build something like that. Try to convince whoever is responsible on a let's say larger level or a higher level than you are, that such a kind of organization makes sense, or at least that it makes sense to add a task, for example, to the task of the quality responsible, to make sure that the project management processes and the reporting processes, that they are really organized and not everybody does what he or she wants. So when we now look at the different planning aspects of planning that we discussed briefly already last time, and we say, okay, we have, in principle, we have these 5 roles. Of course, there may be more for a specific project, but in general, you could say, okay, we have these 5 roles. Yeah. And the PMO. So for the PMO, I've just already added and said, okay, what they need to do is they need to provide for each of this the standards and best practices to be used in a certain corporation. If they say our project schedule, which would be here, which says when do we do what, yeah, we always represent this in Microsoft Project, and we always have this structure of tasks related to project management, and we always have this structure of tasks, for example, for integration testing of software. Then they should actually be able to provide you a template. So what you do as a project manager in planning is to say, in the concrete project that I have, these are my constraints. So you add sort of the numbers, you add the time, but you do not change the structure. That would be the ideal case. And we come back to that later, what are the benefits of that. So throughout this whole planning exercise, we need different input from these people. And now the question is, how do we actually represent who is supposed to do what? And there's one, well, let's say the generic approach to this is called responsibility matrix. Yeah, you just make a matrix, a 2-dimensional matrix, where you say, this is the task, this is the person, and you enter the responsibility. So what is the thing, the person or the group of person, the role in this case, that they have to do. In this particular case, or let's say one of the agreed upon standards on how to do this is what is called a RACI matrix. And that's an acronym which means responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. And the real meaning is like this. The person or the group, the role responsible to do a task is the person who will actually do the work. Yeah? It's not someone who says, yeah, you need to do the work, but it's the person who actually does it. The person who is accountable is the person or the role who says, okay, the way the work was done, the result of the work is okay. It meets the expectations, which could be the project sponsor, for example. You have roles who need to be consulted, which means the person or the role, the guy who is responsible needs to ask them for feedback. And that means not only he or she has to ask, but she also has to answer. That does not mean that, so there is a responsibility on its own defined here, saying, yes, if you are consulted, you need to be asked, but you also need to provide feedback. And providing feedback, of course, in a project normally means in a defined amount of time, not next year. And then we have what is called informed. So a person or a role who needs to know of the decision. He's not contributing to finding the decision, it's just being informed. There are extensions to that where you explicitly say that, for example, a group is ignored. But that's normally not necessary, you just don't give them any kind of responsibility. So if you look at this from the point of view of the initial planning, then what's very simple is the project manager, of course, he is responsible to do all this. That's for sure. He is not accountable because the accountability is with the project sponsor. So when you create your entire project management plan, you say this is how we want to do schedule management, this is how we want to do quality management, everything else. Yeah, you have to define how you want to do it, ideally based on standards provided by your project management office or quality, whoever. But the project sponsor has to understand it, so you need to be able to explain him how to do that, and he needs to accept it. Because what you define here actually says how you want to run the project. And he's giving you the money to do that. So he needs to understand, okay, the way you do this is okay, and I accept it. So what's more interesting is who is going to be involved. So when we remember that integration management really is the question of how do we put all the different bits and pieces in the project together. So how do we organize the dependencies between cost and resources and time, and in case we are going agile, how we are organizing sprints and blah, 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 blah. This is here, and usually you would say, okay, this is the overall framework. And the overall framework is, we don't need to discuss that with the others, because that's something that will be given. But, for example, how we manage scope, that means how do we figure out, first of all, what we need to do, and then when we decided, or we defined what we need to do, how do we handle changes, and how do we handle the effects of changes. That's something where it makes a lot of sense to discuss that with the team. Yeah, you need to actually get their feedback early. And because the stakeholders are being affected by this as well, or maybe affected by this as well, you could also consult them and say, look, if we have a change which affects, for example, delivery of a certain piece of work for 4 weeks or 2 months, this may affect you. So how do we want to handle that? Yeah, how do we want to prioritize that? It's not the discussion about a specific change here. It's a discussion about, in case a change appears, how do we want to go about? The schedule management is something where we are, as we discussed earlier, may have a more influence or more interaction with the functional manager, because if we say we are moving tasks, that also means we move the requirement for certain skills. And that is for the involvement of certain people in the project. And since this person is responsible to make sure we have the right person at the right time, they need to know, of course, in the concrete case, that a change, or let's say a change in date or in milestones is coming. But we also should talk to them and say, how do we want to handle this? How much time do you expect us to have as lead time? So if I tell you today I don't need this person tomorrow, that's bad. But if I tell you today I don't need this person next week, maybe that's better. But we need to agree on how we want to handle that. So cost management, quality management is something which I personally would say we need to do this internally. Internally means in the project team, especially quality management. The quality guy should be part of the team. Somehow we need to embed that. And also cost controlling is, of course, something which the excuse me, which the project manager has to do. And in case we have issues with that, it will be him or her directly with the project sponsor to handle that. To say, okay, now we planned to do this for 100,000 euro, we need 120,000 euro. I see that now. So it's this guy talking to that guy to figure out how we deal with that. Resource management, again, is similar to the schedule management. This is more about, this is when we need persons and this is which person, what type of skill do we need. And this also includes, it really includes an open discussion about what do we do in case we have either from a skill perspective a problem in the project. So let's say the line manager delegated let's say an electrical engineer to my project, and I see that this person is not capable to do the work because of the experience or the skills that he or she has. And we need to think about how we handle that. The other possibility, or let's say the other case would be, there is someone in the project and everything is working well, but then suddenly this person leaves the company. So how do we do that? Yeah, it's not trying to really trying to predict all the different cases. It's just making sure that if we have a case like that, we have a way how we want to address that. Not finding solutions, but just describing the way how we would go to find a solution. Communications management then means who will be informed when, about what is the level of detail, and since they all want to be informed, and they all should actually tell you what they want to know and when they want to know it. And if you agree on all their requests, that's a quite different story, but at least they need to articulate themselves and say, okay, yeah, this is what I need to know. Maybe they say, I don't want to know anything, I just trust you that at the end of the project everything is fine, maybe. Risk management, since risk management really covers all these areas, it's also something which we normally discuss with everyone. Procurement management will be discussed normally only with the line manager responsible for procurement, because everybody else shouldn't have, let's say, a saying in how we do that, because that's his or her responsibility. And procurement management, again, just to recap, means in case we need to buy services or goods from the outside during the project, that's something what we initiate from the project. But all the contracting, everything is a separate set of tasks. And we need to understand where to put that and how to initiate that, what are the lead times. If you have a company which requires, because of internal processes, 2 weeks time for, let's say, for just sending out an order to buy a piece of software for 500 euros, then you need to be aware of that. Then you need, at this point in time, if you're, let's say, if you're really looking and you know what your company is working like, you should define here that, for example, in these cases, you're circumventing the official process and say, okay, we can do this in the project on our own. And then later on, we involve the official procurement, or we just tell them, we execute the process ourselves, we tell them, they are informed, and later on we do all the bookkeeping, because we don't want to wait for so long, because we can't say at the beginning, or let's say with the necessary lead time when we need what. It can happen that we find today that we need something tomorrow, and we need to be prepared for that. And finally, stakeholder engagement, which means when do we talk to the stakeholders? How, on which level do they contribute? Do they actually need to review documents? Do they need to just look at, be part of a steering committee so they see how the project is running? Of course, that's something which we discussed with them, but it should also be discussed with the team, because it's always the team that provides the results. And everything we tell to the outside world, outside means outside of the actual project team, can have an effect on the team. So that means we should be, in this context here, we should agree on when we want to communicate what. It does not mean we're not telling the truth. It just means we have a certain level of confidence that especially small issues, we can all handle them all in the project before escalating to the outside. Because once it's escalated to the outside, very often you as the project manager will be busy to handle all the requests, all the questions that come from here. And you will not be able to do the actual work to make sure that the team is working properly. So you need to find a good balance of, and that's just comes with experience, saying when do you communicate what to the outside? Because always when you give an information to someone, you need to be aware that this information will have an effect on their behavior. Yeah? And so you need to figure out what's the best level. So this variant of the responsibility matrix, I gave this the title of deep involvement. Why? Because really on each level, the project manager is discussing, except this, everything else he or she is discussing with at least one group. And that can take a lot of time. But it makes sense to do this, especially if you have high-risk projects or rather large projects with a lot of involvement, or in case this doesn't exist. Of course, there's an alternative, or let's say the other end of the spectrum is like that, where you say, okay, we do most of the stuff internally. Yeah, because all of this is really given. The functional manager, for example, except in the case of resource management, yeah, he has no saying in that. We have a project, we know how we do schedule management, we will just inform about what are the resource requirements, and the functional manager just has to deliver. That's all. It's a different approach. And you see here also the involvement of the team members is restricted. Yeah, we are discussing here with them everything that affects them directly inside the project. So the scope management, schedule management, quality and resource. But everything else, we could say, no, there's a standard how to do this. There's no need to discuss it. It will be approved by the project sponsor, end of discussion. So when you are in that situation and say, okay, who do I need to talk to set this up? It will depend on your organization. So what is the standard in the organization? And it will also depend on the size, the criticality of the project, and of course of your own experience. If you don't have this, and it's your first project, it's probably a good idea to discuss a little bit more and not just think, okay, I know how to do this. If you don't have this, and it's the 25th project of the same time, but first of all, you should ask yourself, why I don't have this? Because you're repeating. But anyway, in case you wouldn't get this information from the PMO, if you're doing the same type of project again and again and again, I assume you have your own templates. So at least, excuse me. Where we are now is we have set up the initial organization. Yeah, we understood, okay, who do we need to talk to? And it's good practice to say, now that I know who should be involved, do a kickoff meeting. Yeah. And a kickoff meeting really is important. It's not something which is, in most cases, is optional. Because this kickoff meeting, which can be virtual, if you have a team that is distributed over different countries, you don't necessarily have to get everybody together. If it's a big project, a critical one, it makes sense to invest the time to that people actually see each other. And not via a video screen, but really they have a face-to-face meeting. And especially at the beginning of the project, it sometimes also makes sense to say, okay, you have this meeting, and in the evening you go out and have a beer together. This is an investment, and I'm quite serious. This is an investment that will pay off 10, 20, 100 times. Because what you do is you're actually creating a level of trust, and you're creating a level of confidence of being able to talk to each other that will help you in the project to address problems in a much, much easier. Yeah? Because suddenly, if the person who is, let's say, who is delivering a component to you, if this person is just an email address, yeah, and you get the information, it's more difficult let's say you get the package that you are expecting, and you look at it, and you figure out something is missing, something is wrong, blah, 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 blah. If you know this person, you can just call him and just say, look, this and this is missing. Don't just tell me when you're ready. Just tell me when you can deliver an updated version. Fair enough, yeah, and we keep that between us. If this is an official connection, it means what you would actually will do quite naturally is to say, okay, you see this and this and this is not working, write it down. And you need to write it down anyway, yeah? But the question is how you resolve that problem. That will be different. Because then you need to go via the project manager, which is not always a good idea. So, kickoff meeting with all the participants is necessary. Also for the project manager himself, with you. Yeah. You also need to build a level of trust to your project team. They need to trust you that they can tell you things that are not working well. Because it's always easy to report everything is fine. But for this, you don't need reporting. You need reporting for things that don't go well. And that's, again, a matter of trust. So, what it also means, or let's say what also the purpose of the kickoff meeting is that all the project participants, they have a common understanding of what needs to be done. Also, how and when, according at least to what is written in the project charter. Remember, the project charter says, this is what we want to do. These are our major milestones, yeah? And these are the major, let's say, tasks or work packages. We come to that later. And so that everybody understands what really the goal of the project is. And depending on the organization, and depending on the role or the type of the project, the kickoff meeting is really a formalized exercise. So we go formally through a set of issues, or let's say questions, and say, is this clear? Is this clear? Has this been clarified? Yeah. And that is very often the case if this is a project for an external customer. So you have a sales phase, so where we did quotations and all kinds of discussions with the customer. Finally, we did a contract, and the release of the project was really signing of the contract by the customer. And now you need to start the project internally. So it goes from actual sales to execution. And here, it's very important that the part of the organization or the project manager who is running the execution project, that they look at receiving all the required information, everything they need. And it's their responsibility to ask. Sorry. Yeah. And you need to understand that at this point in time, the project is still owned by sales. So if you, as the project manager, are responsible to deliver what has been sold, it's your responsibility to ask whatever information you still need, and it's sales' responsibility to provide that information. Yeah? They can't just give it to you and say, it's now your problem. That shouldn't be the case. So, an example checklist, this is a little bit anonymized from a real checklist from projects that we had been doing. So, where you go through this and say, okay, have all open points from the contracting being closed. Yeah, sometimes in contracting, there is either from the supplier or from the customer side issues where I say, yeah, but we still need to resolve this before we can start the project. Just make a formal check whether that's true. Has there been any communication with the customer since the contract or since signing of the contract which has an effect on the scope? Could be, yeah. You sign a contract, 2 days later the customer calls the sales representatives and says, oh yeah, I forgot, by the way, we ordered that machine to be painted in blue, now it should be painted in green. And the sales guy will always say, oh yeah, no problem. But that information needs to go over to project. Any changes in budget? Same discussion. Yeah? Where we said, okay, now we have an internal budget for the project, that was part of our contract negotiations. And suddenly, I figure out that, oops, we had discussed part of the delivery, for example, with a subsidiary somewhere, whatever, somewhere in France. Yeah. And early in the project, or let's say when we were in the sales phase, they told us we can get the component they need to deliver for 100,000 euros. Suddenly they say, but it's going to cost 150. We should know that, yeah, because otherwise we are on a, let's say, on the wrong page regarding the budget. Do we have updates to the timeline? Do we have updates or, let's say, dependencies on external components or services that we need to take care of? Did we clarify when and how we involve the customer? Yeah, especially that's an especially important part, because this is not necessarily part of the contract. So if you look at the written documents, very often you don't see that. But there's an expectation and an agreement that may have been taken between sales and the customer. For example, when we build a new production line, it's even so that we request and require the customer to nominate 1 or 2 engineers who will work with us on the project, so they learn how everything is working, so they can take over operations later on without, let's say, having an additional 6 months of training. And that, for example, has to be clarified, and it has to be known for the project manager what are the agreements with the customer. This is a practical point, and that is make sure that every document, everything that has been written that defines what to do in the project, that you have it available. Yeah? Otherwise you start the project, we understood what is there. And then first thing you do is you ask, okay, but where are the requirements? What is the current status of the user requirement specification? Where is it? Can I please have a copy of the contract? And then you call sales, you call legal and whoever. And this is the responsibility, or let's say a task during this kickoff, to make sure you have the correct and complete starting point. This is the structure where all the documentation is, all the information is, and it's complete. Everything is in there. Yeah. And finally, you look at what are the internal requirements to do all this, yeah, at least to start, and that they are all given. Yeah. For example, if you say we have a project, and that project, as part of that project, let's take our HR AD integration. As part of that project, of course, we need to have a test environment. And we're now developing this as an external supplier. We're not inside the company, but we're developing for the company, and as an external supplier, a service which does the synchronization between HR and AD. So what that means is, if we sold this, we either must have agreed with the customer that we work on premises, and here is a test system or test systems, or we need to have test systems in-house to work on them. So this is the question that needs to be asked here, whether the way we sold the services and the product, the way we discussed timelines and costs with the customer, whether the necessary internal requirements, so our infrastructure, our tools, everything, whether they have been fulfilled. Because if not, that means you get an extension to the project to build up the necessary infrastructure and test systems, which normally have not been calculated. Yeah? Sales will have sold whatever the customer wanted based on the assumption that we are calculating manpower and maybe software licenses. But normally they will not have thought about, okay, we need to build up a test system, we need to build up this and this and this and this. No, it's just many of these points, you could even say all of these points, yeah? If you have a proper, let's say, problem analysis, requirements analysis, project release process, all of them will be not critical because all of them will be looked at before you actually start the project. But in real life, this is normally not the case. In real life, you will see that some of these points will be missed because you have different organizations working in different phases of the project lifecycle. So the actual sales organization, or let's say in an academic environment, the part of the organization that writes project proposals to the EU, normally they are not the same people who will actually execute the project. Yeah, so there is a lot of sense in trying to make this a formal handover. Oh, sorry. So, when we go now into the actual planning, so structuring everything, there is, of course, one big dependency on what we, that affects what we need to do and how we need to do planning, and that is how we expect, or what the type of project execution model, or rather the lifecycle characteristics of the project will look like. We discussed already a little bit about having waterfall, having agile, blah, blah. But at some point in time, you need to decide what is the model that I'm going to use. Yeah. I mean, now we say this is what we want to do. So how do you decide whether you're going agile or not? How do you do that? And let's say from a little bit simplified point of view, because it's not always black and white, yeah, you can say that we have more or less 4 types of projects, or a project life cycle. What is called predictive, and that's an expression I took from the PM body of knowledge. It's really like, the assumption is, you know in advance what you have to do, you can plan how much time you need, and because of that, because you're very, very sure what the requirements are and how to do things, you can plan from start to end and do things just once. And once you have done everything and integrated everything, you arrive at a defined target, which is you meet the project requirements. One possibility. And in some cases, that is a valid model. Yeah? Not everything is unclear. Not in all cases we need to have burn down charts or points list or something. In some cases, it's very, very obvious. This is what we have to do. This is how much time it needs. We just have to do it. Yeah? The complexity may lie in the number of tasks, but not in each individual task. We have an iterative model where we say explicitly, and this will be shown in the project schedule, that for the different artifacts that we're creating, we will need iterations. Because we assume that either we are making mistakes, or we assume that the customer requirements will change. No? And as part of the project plan, as part of the schedule, we are taking that into consideration and say, okay, we assume that we will have iterations. And because an iteration is always something which does not necessarily affect the entire project, but a part of the work that you're doing, of course, from a planning perspective, and then for the project manager, you need to understand, okay, if I have an iteration in this part of the product, let's just say we have a simple case of having an HMI part and a server part. If I need iterations on the HMI part, that may have an effect on the server part, because suddenly it may mean that we need different functions. Yeah. Why do we have an iteration? Because we're missing one of the requirements, and the requirements may also have an influence on the server. So, different from iterative, we call incremental, which is we are planning to deliver the final solution in bits and pieces. Yeah? And not bits and pieces that are, let's say, that the customer can't do anything about, but each increment has a functionality, has a value for the customer. That is possible. Like, yeah, I mean, if you take the project in Romania, we're doing this in big increments. First increment is the storage area. We have no machine in there, but we have a storage area which is fully automated, which will allow us to centralize all the logistics processes for Eastern Europe. Second part is we have the laboratories. Third part will be we have a single production line. Fourth part will be we have a second production line. Yeah? These are increments. And it makes sense, especially if you have larger projects, to split the project such that the customer sees early, not only that he gets something, but that he gets something which is useful for him. And we will come back to that later in our AD example. And finally, an agile approach, which you could really characterize as, okay, what we really do is we combine these two. Because first of all, we accept we don't know all the requirements. Second, we want to deliver frequently so that the customer has very early in the project, he receives something that has value for him. But we also understand that whatever we delivered may be changed. And that's the sort of, at least conceptually, the discrepant or the difference between incremental and agile. Because here we say, yeah, we're doing one and one and one and one, but we don't really think about, or let's say, don't really, let's say, assume that every increment will also be changed. We are talking about putting stuff on top of each other. Here, we're talking about, okay, I deliver something on top of that, but I can go also can also go back because maybe I misinterpreted or misunderstood the requirements. So, when we say, oh, sorry, this is something probably can't read. This is the Agile Manifesto. Yeah. The important point that I wanted to make here is sometimes, if in a discussion with advocates of the Agile procedure or process, it sounds as if planning and documentation and all that is something that becomes irrelevant. That's not what they say. What they say is, for example here, working software is more important than comprehensive documentation. It does not say, or let's say rather they say explicitly, there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. So it doesn't say forget about documentation. It just says that if I can make a choice between a 100% correct document and 80% correct software, I rather take the 100% correct software and 80% correct or complete documentation. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah? Same with planning. Responding to change is more important than following a plan. Yeah, of course, if I have a change in the project, and that's let's say concerning a critical requirement or functionality for my customer, what does it help if I stick to the plan and finally deliver something he can't use? Yeah, so it's a lot of common sense in there, and that's why there is really not, let's say, it's not an either or. That's what I'm trying to say. As a project manager, you need to understand that you have different ways on achieving certain goals. And in some cases, it makes sense to follow really what is called the predictive approach. And in some cases, it makes sense to be agile. And there are some, definitely not all, but there are some criteria that help you to understand where you are. Okay, this should read reality, by the way. I don't know if you can read that. And for example, if we say we have requirements that are fixed and we really can afford only, or we plan only, we have only budget for doing things once in the entire life cycle of the project and deliver everything only once. Yeah? Then you can follow the predictive approach with the primary goal of making sure we stay in constant schedule. Yeah? That depends really on the main project target. We say we need to get something done, we know exactly what it is, and we need to be in constant schedule. Yeah? That's important. But here, this is important. you can do this only, or let's say it makes sense only if you can trust the requirements with which you start, not only in terms of them being fixed, but also in terms of them being almost complete. I mean, there are always things that are not quite clear, but the things that are not quite clear, they must not affect the concept design of your solution. They must not have an effect on stuff that you, for example, need to buy. Yeah? And for example, here, if you look at Berlin Airport, since this is not really the case, has never been the case. Yeah? The approach that they chose to do this is just wrong, simple wrong. So, if you're going iterative, we know that the requirements are dynamic, meaning they are changing, or uncertain, meaning we don't know them entirely yet. And what you do is you repeat whatever you need to do until it's correct. Of course, that there's a high risk in there that is cost overrun. Yeah, because you're following this, and if you don't have this under control, you repeat, and every repetition costs money, costs time. Yeah, so that may be an issue here, and that puts a strong, let's say, requirement on the project management to make sure, okay, how can we restrict this at least a little bit? So, if you have this, the major, let's say, activity in the first part of the project will be requirements analysis and fixing everything and say, this is what we really want to do. Yeah. Which is, by the way, same for agile. If you, we understand that requirements are uncertain, but nevertheless, in every project, if you want to reach a goal where you say, this is now something that we can deliver and we can close the project, at that point in time, you need to have fixed the requirements. If not, yeah, you can always continue to do iterations, yeah, but you will never reach the target. So here, of course, in the iterative approach, you're focusing pretty much on the correctness of the solution. If you're going incremental, yeah, you have either fixed requirements or you have dynamic requirements. That each of those is possible, yeah, because the primary target here is to say we deliver quickly to the customer something that he or she can use. Even if you know exactly what the final target is, yeah. Even if you know exactly that, for example, in Romania, this is what our entire production should look like, you can still do increments. Yeah? So there's no direct relation to the quality of the requirements. But of course, if you do this with uncertain requirements, it may help you to reduce the cost of change because you're not doing everything at the same time. And then finally, we discussed that already, doing a more agile approach where we say, yeah, what we do is we deliver until what we have, or let's say we iterate until what we deliver is correct. Correct means it meets the customer expectations. And of course, that's good from the point of view of customer value. It's good from the point of view of how quickly we can react to changes. But there's a risk involved regarding project budget. Yeah? Because and that's one of the, let's say, real challenges for project management in this case and in this case, or whenever we have uncertain requirements, that is to balance between we have the possibility to do changes on the one hand side. We want to satisfy the customer requirements, but on the other side, we are restricted in terms of budget, in terms of time, and even the customer has a certain expectation of when the project will be finished. Yeah, at the end of the day, the customer will judge what he receives. Yeah, he will forget, and that's very, very common, he will forget that for a certain, let's say, type of function, he changed the requirements 20 times. He will just see that, oh, now it's working, fine. And when you tell him later on that, yeah, but to get this working, we spend 20,000 euro instead of 2,000, yeah, and you didn't tell him before, and you didn't work with him through this process and say, look, you change this, you change this, you change this, make him aware that what is happening, he will not understand why the costs are so high. So that's your sort of major task as a project manager in all these areas. Whenever you have uncertain requirements, to have the customer in the boat and make him or her understand that every time he's changing something, every time something becomes clear that has been assumed to be otherwise before, that has a potential effect on cost and time. So I said already that it's not black and white. So in a project, you can have, of course, different situations. Excuse me. So first of all, let's say as a buzzword, if you look today into publications about project management, many of those will talk about hybrid approaches. A hybrid approach really is you take your brain, yeah, common sense, and say, okay, this is a task which makes sense to do in a very structured manner. This is a task which makes sense to do in a more iterative manner. This is a task which makes sense to do agile. Yeah, just take the different ways how to do things as a toolbox and use whatever tool is appropriate. That's all about hybrid, more or less. So the way this could look like, for example, is if you have a task or a project to develop something, an application that should be rolled out worldwide, you could say the entire development, yeah, until the final, or let's say the first release, you can organize in sprints doing an agile approach until you're there. But then, yeah, because you're going into operations and you're changing real, let's say, live systems, which are used by people to do real work, to earn actual money. You can't, maybe you don't want to do this. Maybe you want to have a very strict plan to say, okay, today we are updating the servers in France and we do it like this, this and this and this and this. And here we have a gateway. If at this point in time we see we have a technical problem that prevents us from rolling out, we roll back, we stop, and we start again whenever. And that would be really a pretty much a predictive approach and say this and this and this and this, and then off we go. Whereas in the earlier phase of the project, you could do an agile approach. could also be different. If we say, yeah, what we are doing is we are creating, let's say, a standard solution for an integration, an automation of a production line. And we know exactly what we need to do because we know the process, we know the equipment, everything. We prepare everything. But then we go to our site in Argentina. And honestly, we don't really know what we will find there. We don't know when we will have people available. We don't know their production plans yet because they may change based on customer requirements. So we don't really know how and when we can integrate there. So what we will do, we will prepare everything. And then we'll do this stepwise. Every morning, sit together with the production people, say, okay, what can we do today? How can we integrate this? Do we have access to that? And do this stepwise until finally we have the integration completed. And what this shows really is make sure you understand that this is no religious war here. These are just tools. How to run a project and how to organize the task in a project is just a matter of choosing the right approach to reach the project goal. Yeah? It's not agile versus traditional. That doesn't make sense. So now, let's have a brief discussion, which is good, because then I can do a little bit about my voice. What would be a suitable approach from your point of view for the AD-HR integration? How would you do that? Just, can you just make teams of 2 or 3 people, and then each team can just present what they would do? So everybody came to a conclusion? And there's no right and wrong. Yeah, it's just I'm interested to hear sort of what your reasoning would be. Who wants to start? Okay. Okay. So why should the first part be agile? Is there a, I'm just interested. You think there's a dependency between the size of the project and the model? Yeah. That's why we have hybrid. That's exactly the point where we say, okay, we need, for example, we need to have an overall framework so everybody knows which part he's working on, he or she. But in these parts, you can have a different approach. You can say, okay, but this is what we are developing in an agile model. Okay, thanks. Okay. Understood. Yeah. And you see, I think there is nothing where you can say, yeah, but this, the reasoning either there or there is wrong. Just, yeah, what we will need to have is, let's say, understand a little bit more the additional constraints that we may have. Okay, your idea? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so pretty much in the same line as you. Okay. And the two of you, any idea? So it's really, it really comes down, I think, a little bit to additional constraints. And just let me, so I tell you what I would have done. Yeah, I would have done this. But that's why? Because I have in my head something which you can't know, which is we have different levels. We have, first of all, we have the user identification. So which users do exist? Which users exist in the company? And that means on the Active Directory part, against sort of which users are known in AD and what are their passwords. It has nothing to do with access rights, nothing at all. It's just identification. And what I would have done, that's probably, yeah, I'm just thinking loud here, is okay, make sure first that this is what we get working. Make sure that when we create or activate a user in HR, that this user is known in AD, so that he or she can log on to our machines. Don't talk about the access rights right now, because the access rights is really, that's in SAP, it's called an event management. And that's a highly complicated module, which is normally also very much customized to the individual users, users meaning the corporation which uses SAP. And to figure out on how to map this then to an AD structure, is something where you either say, okay, if I want to do this one shot, I either do this, I need to understand for each department how do they actually use that and how do they structure it, or I go really an approach where we say, I take department for department, because the department-specific rights will also be a substructure somewhere here. Sorry. Yeah, somewhere here in the AD structure. Yeah. So doing one of these, and the choice between these two would really be, how well is this documented? And if it's not well documented, so you need to figure out really what is the structure here and how do we need to map it here. I would do this. But not because of the structure of the software, but because of the uncertainty of the requirements. Yeah? And I completely agree that it's also important. These small deliveries don't mean we have, let's say, small deliveries for each sprint. That's important, yeah, because this process, this synchronization process here, this is critical. So we need to understand that, yes, we're making small deliveries to understand what is working, so where are we? But the question of when we do deployment, so when we take what we have and put it into operation, that's a different discussion. So this let's say, two model approach, saying do some development in a more agile manner, and then decide how to roll it out and do this then in a very structured way to say, okay, now we have this, it's tested, and now it's being deployed, and now it goes into the organization to do this in a more predictive way. Yeah, I think that in this case makes a lot of sense. But again, all of this, yeah, depends on your project manager, project team, assessment of the as-is situation in the company. So you see already here, this looks like a small task, but there are quite a few constraints which may have or may not have an impact on the project. Okay, so. So, coming back to our planning tasks. So now we have, let's say, somehow we agreed on how we want to run the project. Maybe we haven't agreed yet. We are just looking at structuring the things that need to be done. Put them into packages where we can say, okay, now for this package we can decide whether we go in a predictive way, or for this package we decide we go in an agile way. Yeah? And we already discussed that when we define what we call the project management plan, we look at these various aspects here, from scope management to stakeholder engagement. And the integration, this is why the head is here, is really what your major task, or one of the major tasks of you as a project manager is, to make sure you balance all these different aspects properly during the project, and you react on disturbances that come naturally from the real world. So when we look now at scope management, this is the first point, and it's also one of the most important points, because the question and the definition of what you have to do will drive most of the other things. If you know what to do, you can decide when to do it. You can decide which resources you need. You can make an estimation of how much it's going to cost. You can make an estimation of which risks are involved. Yeah? If you don't know what to do, you're somewhere in the woods. So, again, what does scope management mean? We discussed that already. Say, you need to make sure that we do everything that is needed, but only what is needed. No? Not do more than necessary, but do everything that's required. So the scope management plan really says, okay, how do we do this? How do we define the scope? How do we validate what's in and what's out? And how do we check while the project is running that we are not leaving anything behind and we don't put anything on top of what we already originally discussed? Yeah? And the basis for everything, for the entire control in the project, is what we call a project scope statement. Again, that's an expression from the PM body of knowledge. And that can be expressed in something which we look at later. It's called, for example, a work breakdown structure. Yeah? And again, there will be a discussion as, yeah, work breakdown structure is typically something which people associate more with the waterfall model, but that's not true. It's as useful for an agile approach as it is for a traditional approach. We just need to understand really the purpose of it. So when we look at the scope management plan, there are a few questions that need to be answered. First of all, who is responsible for scope management? That should be easy, because normally that should be the project manager. Then how do we define the scope? And here, it's, let's say, the reasoning should be, the better we define what we have to do, the better we can control it. That's very simple. There are different ways to do this. For example, a work breakdown structure is really like a tree structure where we have different work packages in there, what we have to do. A statement of work is something which we very often use when we work with external suppliers. So to tell them, this is exactly what you have to do. It's like a project charter for a part in the project, more or less. So how will we achieve the scope? And that comes back to asking ourselves, okay, these are the packages, how do we handle the packages? Which part do we buy, which part do we create ourselves? For which part, also for which part do we use which approach? How do we measure it? That's also interesting, because I define, this is what I want, and I have 6 months time. So now I'm at 2 months. So how do I measure where I am? Did I actually create and deliver and build already a third of what I wanted? Or am I at 10%? And is that a problem or not? That's something which, as a project manager, I need to answer these questions. And to be able to answer them in the project, I need to think about upfront, how am I going to measure this? Because this is also something, you remember that, we agree with the project sponsor. He or she needs to understand, okay, if we have this task, and the way we measure progress is like that. For example, just an arbitrary example, you have a task which involves creating 10 documents. And the easiest way to do this would be to say, okay, you measure by the amount of documents you created. But if 5 of these documents are very simple, just copies of what you have, and 5 are 200 pages each, where you need engineering know-how to put into them, and you just measure by the amount of documents, it would not be a good measure. At least it would be a measure, but it doesn't tell you anything. So this is something you need to think about. Also, how you handle changes. So what happens if somebody says, okay, from the outside, says, we originally said that, for example here, we want only to take the skills and the capabilities of the personnel from the event management. And now they say, yeah, but remember, we have this particular external application which does everything for our HR, including talent management, which is a new buzzword, talent management application. We want to have that as well. So, not how do we do this technically, but how we do it from a project management perspective to say this is a new requirement, this is something which was out of scope so far. How do we put it into the project? How do we assess the time involved in taking care of it? How do we assess the cost involved in taking care of it? The risks involved, because it may actually have an effect on the architecture just that we just already created or finished. Maybe even on something we installed already. How do we do that? And who is finally responsible to authorize that? And that's simple. It must be the project sponsor. Because this guy gave us the money. And if now somebody who didn't give us money comes along and says, I want this in addition, they can only have a request, but they can't decide. So this is the approval part. And finally, who is responsible for accepting the project deliverables? You could say at the end of the day, it's the project sponsor, but usually this person will delegate that. So in this case here, normally, it will be the case that, for example, an HR responsible or an IT responsible will be the person who accepts, or let's say just checks, and finally then accepts what we did. And they will report to the project sponsor and say, okay, now they did their job properly, we can close the project. Okay. So, because I'm My voice is going away. I would suggest it's also 11:15. Then we stop here for today. Now, before you go, just make a brief overview. So, as said before, on the 26th, I won't be here on the 26th, so we have to move the lesson to Friday the 23rd, and we have 4 options here. 8, 9:45, 11:30, 1400. So, who is in favor of, or not in favor? Let's just say for whom 8 o'clock would be possible. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. 9:45. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6. Okay. 11:30. That looks 1, 2, 9. 1400. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7. Okay, so then we do this. Okay? I will tell you again next time, because we have the regular lesson next week on Monday, and then in the same week also on Friday. Yeah? Yeah, same room. Same room. Okay? Thank you.